Hey guys, we are going to be a quiz whiz for the scholastic news out of this world. So last week we read about the space station and all the different things they had to do, like sleeping and eating, and how they accommodated those things on the space station. And then we read yesterday about the election and five big things to learn about the election. And then now we're doing the quiz whiz, okay? So I'm going to kind of walk you through this. Listen all the way through because it'll help you answer these questions. So for the first one, we're going to go to Life in Space because it tells me to go to that article. So when I go to the Scholastic News, I click on Out of This World. And I can go to Life in Space one of two ways. I can open up the presentation view if you want to just listen to the whole thing before you take this quiz. That would probably be great, and the presentation view is great for that. But we're going to click right here on Life in Space. Okay, so now that I have that article pulled up and ready, this is the article that we read about the different types of things astronauts had to do in order to live on the ISS, okay? And so let's look at the first question. The ISS is the International Space Station. So the International Space Station is similar to a home on Earth because astronauts can conduct experiments using plants there. Astronauts can visit outer space anytime they want. Well, our home on Earth, we can't visit outer space anytime we want. And it said similar, which means alike. So we know that one's really wrong. Astronauts can live, eat, sleep, and work there. So it's similar, it's alike because they can live, eat, sleep, and work. That sounds pretty good because that's what it was about. Astronauts can go on spacewalks to do repairs. Well, it talked about that, but that's not similar to what we can do at home. I can't go on a spacewalk. So that's not similar to home. So this B, or the second one and the fourth one, are not it at all. Okay, I need to go back. I don't remember anything about using plants as experiments. So I'm just going to, wrong one. I'm just going to scroll through here and see if there's anything about plants and experiments. Talked about planets. Let's see. Talked about gravity. Talked about the sleeping bag. Talked about walking in space. Now you have to be attached to the space station and have this special suit on so you can breathe. Talked about eating and how the food has to be freeze-dried so that it can last for months. And then it talked about getting to work, okay, how they would work on the space station. Now here it talks about research projects. And here it does talk about testing how different foods can be grown in space. Here's the big thing. Foods, we can't test how foods are grown in space here in the U.S. We can conduct experiments using plants, but I think the better answer is, let's see. Yeah, that's one thing it does talk about, working on how food can be grown in space. But what it's mostly talking about is how they live there, how they eat there, how they sleep there, and how they work there. And their work is that experimenting part. So this is just one small part. This is like all the parts. So if it was me, and I would be correct, I would pick C. And that is the correct answer there. So that would be what I would pick. All right, let's look at number 2. Which is most likely to happen in the future based on the text, okay? Based on number 1. So number 1, we picked that they live, eat, sleep, and work there. What is most likely to happen in the future? Astronauts will go on missions to other planets. A tiny new space station will replace the ISS. The ISS will become a museum. Modules will be removed from the ISS. I need to go back. I don't remember them talking about going to other planets. Let's come up here. For 20 years, space travelers from more than 15 countries have journeyed to the International Space Station, a giant laboratory that orbits the Earth. American astronaut Christina Koch is one of them. In February, she returned home to Texas as a record setter. Koch had spent 328 consecutive days in space. It was the longest single space flight ever by a woman. Astronauts like Koch spent months at a time on the ISS conducting important experiments. Scientists hope their findings will prepare astronauts for future missions to Mars and beyond. Okay. Over the past 2 decades, the ISS has grown from a few small sections called modules to a station the size of a football field. So what's it like to live and work more than 200 miles above the Earth? Koch says it's a lot different than life on our planet. Okay, so let's go back and look. Astronauts will go on missions to other planets. It did say that. It said it would help them prepare to go to Mars. It didn't say anything about replacing the ISS. It didn't say it was going to become a museum. And it didn't say they were removing any modules. So the best answer for number 2 is A, or this first choice. Astronauts will go on missions to other planets. And I know that because right here it said that they might go on future missions to Mars and beyond. See how I have to have these 2 tabs open and constantly go back and forth? You can't answer this unless you're going back to the text. Okay, which detail best supports the answer to question 2? So the fact that they're going on other missions and it was the longest single space flight. Their findings will prepare astronauts for future missions to Mars and beyond. That's it right there. That's what we just looked at in the text and said that was the reason we picked. Astronauts will go on missions to other planets. So the second choice, B, is the correct and the best answer. Okay. Then yesterday, you read 5 big questions about voting. So we need to go back here before we get started. We're going to click up here where it says October 19th because that's the one that it is. And we're going to go down here to 5 big questions about voting. You can watch that video if you want, and we're going to scroll down and we're going to come back here. Which of the following is not a requirement to vote in U.S. elections? Okay, so that's going to be in this first section, who's allowed to vote. Most adults in the U.S. are eligible to vote in the presidential election as long as they are registered or officially signed up to do so. To register, a person must meet certain requirements. For instance, voters must be at least 18 years old on or before Election Day, a citizen of the United States, and be able to prove which state he or she lives in. So, which one of these is not a requirement? You do not have to be a college graduate, okay? So, you had to be 18 years, you had to be a U.S. citizen, and you had to officially be registered. But you do not have to graduate college in order to vote. In fact, there are lots of people who have not gone to college that still vote. Okay, Section 2 is mostly about, okay, so let's go back. We were in Section 1, now we're going to go to Section 2. I hear adults talk about how important it is to have the right to vote. Didn't Americans always have that right? No, not all of them. Today there are about 150 million registered voters in the U.S. They include women, men, and people of all races. But that wasn't always the case. When George Washington was elected in 1789, only about 6% of the population was allowed to vote. And they were mostly white men who owned land. For more than 100 years after that, black people, women, and indigenous people fought for their right to vote. But even when a group wasn't granted suffrage, that means they didn't get to vote. But even when they were granted suffrage, that means the right to vote, they didn't always get to vote. For example, laws in some states prevented black people from voting for decades after they legally won the right. So it's about voting rights weren't always equal and fair. That sounds pretty good. Voters participated in the first election. It wasn't about the first election. Voting is conducted in different places. It wasn't about where voting happens. Land ownership affects the right to vote. Today, this one's tricky because it did mention land ownership, but that was from the past. but not today. So the best one for this is voting rights weren't always equal in the United States. Okay, I have done half of this with you. You need to do like I just did. Okay, so you need to look right here at section 5. So you're going to go here, right to vote. You're going to go down to section 5, and you're going to read that section to answer this question 6. Then Scholastic Turns 100 is another article. So we're going to go back up to the top. Click October 19th. And we're going to go to Scholastic Turns 100. And you'll read this article to answer that question. We are going to summarize that article. So what is it mostly about? Okay, it says it uses you a lot. Let's read. Here's a look at what life might have been like if you were a kid in the 1920s. So it's trying to help you imagine what it would have been like to be a kid in the 1920s. A movie ticket cost 15 cents. You might have seen Felix the Cat. So this is if you were a kid in the 1920s. It was the silent film era. Movies didn't have spoken dialogue. Babe Ruth might have been your favorite athlete in his first season with the New York Yankees. Your family owned a car. It was probably a Ford Model T in the 1920s. Most people did not have telephones, but if you did have a telephone, they looked like this. And you probably didn't even have electricity. Your mom might have had the right to vote, though, for the first time in the 1920s. Okay? So the reason they use the word you over and over and over is because they're trying to help you feel like what it would have been like to live during the 1920s. I'm not going to tell you which answer is correct, but I'm just helping you that way. Should kids follow a dress code at home? We didn't read this article either, but I think you're going to like it. This is why listening to the whole magazine might help you too. So to answer this one, we're going to scroll down to should kids follow a dress code at home? Okay, so that's this article right here. And there's some people who say yes, and there's some people who say no. Okay, and so you're going to read this, and then you're going to answer the question here. So which statement would both Daniel and Valentina agree with? Okay, so Daniel said yes, and Valentina said no. So what would they both agree with? They would probably both say no offensive clothing, whether you're at school in a dress code or whether you're at home in your own clothes. I'm guessing. I would have to read it. Let's go to the bottom. This talks about offensive graphics, and that's distracting. And this says your outfit doesn't need to offend anyone. So I really think that they would probably both say offensive clothing is not bad, both of them. Which statement supports the idea that students should follow a dress code while learning at home? So for that one, you're going to look at the yes kid to figure out which one of those statements fits with what the yes kid said. Okay, you have got this. If you have questions, get back on with me. Thanks.